Do your clients have a hard time touching their toes, or when they do deadlifts, they feel their lower back kicking on as soon as they come up out of that deadlift? Then you should try this exercise. Hi, I'm Alex Zephyr, founder of Resilient Training Rehab, and I've helped thousands of trainers and therapists from around the world get faster and more consistent results with their clients. Let's get into it. So before we get into the actual mechanics of the exercise, it's important to understand why people can't touch their toes or they start to use their back when they come up from doing a deadlift, or they feel their back when doing a deadlift. When we are touching our toes, it's important that our pelvis, especially the back side, can open up. So a lot of times when people can't touch their toes, it's because this space is pretty closed. They've got this pelvis that is more externally rotated. All the muscles in the back of the pelvis are a little bit stiff, and so they kind of squeeze their glutes all the time. And then when they bend over, touch their toes, they're kind of crunching, and so they don't have the ability to open up this space to be able to get down into the pelvis. So when I'm looking at this, especially when we're initially starting to bend over, it's important that this sacrum is able to move away from the sit bone. So if I've got this pelvis that's squeezed like this, I'm just gonna flop right over. But what should happen is the sacrum should be moving away from the sit bone. Again, the sacrum can't move this much, but just think of a little bit of motion from the sacrum that is then going to influence the muscles in this area. The sacrum goes back as I'm touching my toes. Once I get to about mid-thigh level, that's when the femurs really kick on to start to internally rotate the hips, which creates even more space in the back of the hip to allow me to bend over, touch my toes. So if you've got a client who's got a lot of stiffness in the back and they test with limited hip internal rotation, maybe their straight leg raise is very limited, well, this is probably what you're looking at, is the stiffness going to the backside. So with this knee to wall hinge, there's two major things that this is accomplishing. And this is why I really like to use the foam roller, because it helps keep the back part of the pelvis open while it also reinforces that hip internal rotation. So what we're doing is, as we bend over, as I said, we want this back space to open, okay? We also want the posterior capsule of the hip, which is basically just the space between this pointy part of the femur, called the greater trochanter, and the sit bone, to move away from each other. If I have a pelvis that's squeezed, like all these muscles in the back are tight, then this femur is gonna be pulled back, and you're not gonna have a lot of space in the back of the pelvis or back of the hip to be able to accomplish this movement. So by having my knee at 90 degrees and pushing the knee into the foam roller, that's going to create this natural internal rotation of the femur. And by keeping the knee slightly bent the whole time, I am going to keep this posterior capsule open. When you see people, when they come up from a deadlift, they are gonna hyperextend their knees. When that knee goes back, just think this back part of the hip is closing. It is externally rotating because you're getting a lot of the glute max to kick on to externally rotate. That's not to say that when we're doing this kind of deadlift, we're not gonna get the glute max. We're 100% going to do that, but it's important to understand that these people already have these stiffer glutes. The glutes are already contracted. And if we want them to effectively work, we need to make them go into a lengthened position first and then allow them to contract, but not contract to a point where the pelvis starts to turn away and we start to squeeze all these areas. So what this knee to wall hinge is gonna do is, because I'm pushing into the foam roller, that is essentially going to cause the foam roller to push back into my hip, which is going to open up this space a little bit more. And then by keeping this space open, I'm going to be able to relax the muscles in the back of the hip as I now do that hinge, and that is going to create more space in the back part of the pelvis as I'm bending over, which is why it feels like I've got more room to touch my toes. And oftentimes, I will use this as a starting exercise when I'm teaching a hinge, especially in a kickstand position versus doing it bilaterally with 2 feet. This just allows them to put a little bit more weight onto this side, which again, just opens up more space in the back part of the hip. And by focusing on pushing into the foam roller, it prevents that knee from hyperextending and keeping that hip in an internally rotated position to allow the pelvis to do what it's supposed to do. So to set up this exercise, what I want you to do is place the foam roller against the wall. Now, if the foam roller is too short, obviously you're gonna kind of hit your head. So you can put a yoga block there just to bring yourself further, or use a longer foam roller. But what I want you to do is put the foam roller against your knee, and I want your knee to be in line with the front part of your shoelaces. So basically where the knuckle of your toes are. So the balls of your toes, your knee is going to be in line in that position. What that's going to do is give you enough knee flexion to keep that hip open. This is going to facilitate that internal rotation of the femur that we talked about. With the foot pressure, I want you to keep the heel and the ball of the big toe in contact with the ground at all times. Even as I'm bending over, it's gonna feel like I'm falling forward. I don't want you to lose pressure through the heel. I really want you to keep the pressure through the ball of the big toe. Then what I'm gonna do is I'm going to grab on the opposite side. I'm gonna grab a dumbbell or kettlebell, and I'm gonna go on my toes on the back leg. It's important that I'm not opening up and facing away from the foam roller, but I'm turning in towards, just so I can get more of the back of the hip. But I don't want you to do that by turning the pelvis or turning the rib cage. Instead, I want you to think like you're letting this kettlebell win. It's letting you pull down towards the ground, which is going to turn the sternum slightly towards, or turn your chest slightly towards this lead leg. So, got the balls of the big toe, contact with this left leg. I'm letting the kettlebell pull me a little bit. My knee is actively pressing into the foam roller. You can see it's kind of bending a little bit. And I'm staying heel heavy on this right side. And then when I'm going down, I'm thinking of my sit bone. So if you feel like where your sit bone is, that sit bone is going to go up towards the ceiling as you bend over. So it's not a hips going back. It is I'm keeping the same position, but my hips are just tilting forward as I go down. Again, you're gonna feel like your weight wants to go in your toes, and that's totally cool, but just make sure that heel stays in contact with the ground, still pressing into the wall. As I come up, pressing through my foot, pressing my knee into the foam roller, and my hips are gonna come through. So I'm gonna breathe in as I go down, pushing the foam roller into the wall, sit bone going up towards the ceiling. As I come up, pushing into the foam roller. And so I want you to do this for about 2 sets of about 8 reps, and you should feel a lot of glute activity. You should feel no back. The back should be nice and relaxed. And you may even feel a little bit of hamstring kicking on. Now, if you want to add a little bit more help towards this and really get even deeper into the glute, we could do a toes elevated position. By flexing the ankle, that is going to naturally allow the knee to be able to flex a little bit more, which is going to translate up to the hip and get that femur to internally rotate. So you're just gonna get deeper into that hip, and it's gonna feel like, for some people, it's gonna feel like it's much more stable and easier to make this type of movement and keep the knee pressing into the foam roller, because I'm gonna have more contact with the balls of my big toes. So as I mentioned, this is one of my favorite exercises, just to teach people how to be able to hinge properly without using their back or without compensating, because it just gives them that extra stability and that extra constraint using the wall, using the foam roller. So if you want some more information on exercises like this that I like to include in warm-ups, but also strength training programs for my clients, then check out our free warm-up program below, and I'll see you next time.